Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for the fifth installment of my series Live Bitcoin Interviews. This is the first time I'm actually being hosted here at BLOCKTV, so thanks to everybody for hosting me. And we have here Meni Rosenfeld.
Hi.
I'll introduce Meni in a second, but before I'll just say I've been involved with Bitcoin since 2011. I'm now an active angel investor and advisor in the field. And if you want to get more emails on the upcoming episodes in the series or more interviews, then just email me or subscribe to the channel. So, hi Meni.
Hi.
Meni has been involved in Bitcoin also from 2011. We actually met at the first Bitcoin meetup ever in Israel. I found Bitcoin just shortly before. I looked on meetup.com. I saw a meetup, so I went. And in the meetup, there was me, Meni, and another guy. I think Meni remembers his name, I don't. And the other guy left after about 10 minutes. And then there were Meni and me, and that was the beginning of our relationship 8 years ago. Meni is currently the chairman and maybe the key force behind the Israeli Bitcoin Association. He did a master's degree at the Weizmann Institute. Has done several some research in the field of Bitcoin and crypto, and has been formerly headed the research at a similar group as well. So, hi Meni, how are you doing today?
Hi, fine, thanks. How are you?
Very good. So I will do a quick intro session. I always do with everybody, just some warm-up questions. Maybe some of these are a bit banal, but I just like to get them to know, your relation to Bitcoin. So when did you buy your first Bitcoin, and how did you get into the space?
Okay, so that was in March 2011. I think it's the same month that you entered the scene. And so actually I heard about Bitcoin from a website called lesswrong.com. It's a community blog dealing with rationality and related topics such as transhumanism, cryonics, friendly AI, and so on. So they're connected to a research institute it's now called Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI. Back then it was called differently. And they started accepting donations in Bitcoin. So there was a post in Less Wrong about this. And I read this post like I read many posts from Less Wrong. And that's when I first heard about Bitcoin. And I was in a pretty unusual situation. For most people, when they first hear about Bitcoin, they don't know in advance the problem it's supposed to solve. So you need to convince them that there is a problem and that Bitcoin is the solution. In my case, I already understood there is a problem. And actually, the concept of cryptocurrency, I've heard about it before I first heard about Bitcoin, and thought it's very interesting because I wanted to take the technological digital revolution and apply it to finance and money and economics, which are things which are mostly done the same way they were always. So I had some interest in finding a technological solution for cryptographic money, and it's a shame that I didn't spend more time looking into it, because if I had, I would have heard about Bitcoin sooner. But anyway, I didn't pursue it too much, but it was in the back of my head. I was open to receiving the idea of cryptographic currency. And so I heard about Bitcoin, and very quickly I started being active in it. I will mention another thing, that back then I was also interested in the concept of monetizing computational power. So the idea being that if you have a computer that can do computations, and there are people looking to do computations, so they could outsource their computation to your computer, and you could get some payment for it. So that's a concept which back then I thought about how this could be done. So this resonated very nicely with the concept of mining in Bitcoin, where back then it was just on the on the transition between CPU to GPU. So whatever the case, if a month or two before I entered the scene, you could do it with the GPU. After that, you could do it with the CPU. You could do it before. Now you can do it with GPU. Either way, if you have a computer, you can use it to make money. So I thought it was an interesting concept.
Okay, so how long did it take from you from hearing about Bitcoin for the first time to actually buying some? And later you also provided the service Bitcoin, right, to help others buy?
Yes, so I think the first thing I did was mining before I bought Bitcoins. I mined Bitcoins. I used a GPU I had at the time, which wasn't very good for the purpose. Back then, ATI GPUs were much superior for mining Bitcoin than NVIDIA. I had an NVIDIA GPU, so I mined a bit. And yeah, and before I bought my first Bitcoins, I wanted to be sure that I'm able to sell them, right? Because I see people talking about Bitcoin, and there was an exchange rate back then it was $1 per Bitcoin. And I wasn't completely convinced that it's real. I mean, just because I see some website which says one Bitcoin is $1, I was not convinced that if I have Bitcoins, I can actually get dollars out of it. So I wanted to mine some Bitcoins, sell them, and only then I was confident enough to buy. And that was a bit troublesome because back then there weren't that many good options to sell Bitcoins, and I tried selling on empty GOX, but then I found out that withdrawing the money was harder than I thought. Luckily, eventually I came across a website called CoinCard by Michael Hendricks, which allowed you to sell Bitcoins and get a payment in PayPal in return. So I did that, and it went smoothly. I mean, it took me some time to find that website, but once I did, it was a very good website. And there is a sister website also by Michael Hendricks called CoinPal, where you can buy Bitcoins for PayPal. So after I saw that I could sell Bitcoins and get PayPal payment, I went to CoinPal to buy a larger amount of Bitcoins back. And yeah, and then you mentioned Bitcoins. So like I said, I could buy Bitcoins with PayPal, and I wanted to invest in Bitcoin. Problem is that because of all the problems with PayPal, that was very expensive to do it with this website, with PayPal. So actually that's one of the main reasons I started Bitcoin, which was Israel's first Bitcoin exchange service, because what I had in mind back then, and it was completely wrong, but what I had in mind is that there are probably a lot of people in Israel who learned about mining and mined some coins, and they want to sell them. So I say that I'm willing to buy and sell Bitcoins, but I adjusted the prices so people are incentivized to sell to me. Right? So based on the exchange rate, as you could take from empty GOX at the time, convert to shekels, then I took no fee for people selling to me, and I took some fee for people buying for me. So I thought that would encourage people to sell to me, but that did not happen. People only wanted to buy. So I wanted to buy for myself, and I wanted to buy to be able to sell to others. And yeah, so I learned that I need to find some sustainable way to buy Bitcoin. So yeah, so I did what I had to do to be able to do wire transfers from my bank to empty GOX's account, started buying Bitcoins, and so on. So yeah, so that's the story about that.
Okay. I think I'll actually jump towards this day. And again, this is a question I ask everybody I interview, and you can answer in however level of specificity that you want. But generally, how does your crypto or altcoin or Bitcoin portfolio look like? Like, I assume you own some Bitcoin in that, but like, what's the percentage of Bitcoin to alts? Are there any alts that that you hold, let's say?
Well, okay, the majority is in Bitcoin. I do have some alts. I don't remember all of them, and those that I remember, I don't necessarily want to list. I do have some Litecoins, some Ether. These are, I think, the main alts.
Have you sold your all the Bitcoin forks, Bitcoin Cash, and whatnot?
So yeah, with things like Bcash, I don't care about it enough to dump it. So I still have most of the Bcash I had received when the fork did. Same for Bcash SV. I didn't touch it too much. But yeah, so I have some of those. But however you look at it, the majority of is Bitcoin. And paradoxically, even though I am more interested in Bitcoin than the others, when it happens that I need some fiat currency as well, I usually sell my Bitcoins because I know how to deal with them. I have a wallet I use frequently. It's easier for me to sell Bitcoins than to sell any other alt that I don't frequently use. So maybe over time, the percentage of Bitcoin went down a bit. But yeah, like I said, majority is Bitcoin. Yeah.
Okay. And do you, I don't know, I guess two questions. Like when was the last time you actually actively bought a new coin? And what do you think of the, the options of privacy coins that exist, the various privacy coins?
Well, let's see. When was the last time I bought a coin? I'm not completely sure, actually. It depending on what you count, but maybe a year ago. Well, with regards to privacy coins, well, I'm not that much of a privacy buff myself, so I can see why people would want privacy coins, but I don't, for myself, really believe in the idea of privacy is something crucially important, so I'm not that bullish about privacy coins. And other than that, there's the issue of whether any of the currently existing privacy coins are actually worth anything. And I guess in that regard, probably Monero is one of the more what's the word? More reliable coins, I guess, or more noteworthy.
Okay.
So I didn't spend that much time looking into it, but what I did try to look into was pretty favorable. So maybe that's good.
So actually, maybe I'm running two lines of questioning in parallel here. So I have two follow-ups. So you said you bought a coin maybe a year ago. So I'm very curious on what you bought around that time, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into it, and that's assuming I remember exactly. But yeah, it's best not to get into that.
Okay, and on the matter of privacy coins, so do you think so there is the question of how much privacy do people need, right? And today in Bitcoin, if I pay you for this cup of coffee, you pretty much know all my financial history. And of course, there are ways to make it harder, but ultimately, there's no bulletproof solution for that right now implemented in Bitcoin. So where do you see that? How do you see that problem being solved in the future in Bitcoin?
Yes, so in the future, then yeah, there is a concept of confidential transactions in Bitcoin, bulletproofs, and all sorts of things. Also, paying with the Lightning Network has a different privacy profile than paying with on-chain Bitcoin. So it's different and mostly better privacy. So I think there are solutions even within the current Bitcoin protocol, definitely if you modify it a bit. And I think that right now humanity is not really prepared for real privacy. So I think Bitcoin, as it stands right now, offers a good privacy trade-off in relation to how humanity works at the moment. In the future, when there is more willingness to accept more privacy, then I think Bitcoin can evolve as well. And this relates strongly with the issue of regulators. And I spend a lot of time talking with regulators. Maybe we'll talk about that later too. But when I do, it's very convenient for me to be able to say that Bitcoin is not effective for money laundering because all the transactions public on the blockchain, so it's not private, it's not anonymous. Well, actually, no, it is somewhat private, it's not anonymous, but there is some tension. I mean, there's enough room to be able to work with regulators to actually stop crime. So at this point, it's important to not be completely anonymous, to have some level of accountability, but over time, it's definitely possible that, regulation will change, governments will change, and humanity as a whole will demand more privacy, and then we can, allow Bitcoin to enter the mainstream even with anonymity features.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. So, why do you've spent most of a large part of the last 8 years, I think, to Bitcoin, basically, to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So why do you love it so much, or what makes you passionate about it?
Okay, so that is a multifaceted question. I think okay, so I do love it because it's simply something that can make the world a better place, and it's more efficient. It can allow a new economy which is more transparent and open and empowering to people. So there are a lot of things about Bitcoin which are very good, and I want to help. And like I said, this also resonated with thoughts I had even before I heard about Bitcoin. But that's only part of the story. I mean, it's in addition to my love for Bitcoin, which does exist, and my desire to promote it, which does exist, there's also the issue of comparative advantage and opportunities. So, there are a lot of other things that I am interested in and I could be promoting, but in Bitcoin, because of my history, because I'm in it deep, I think I can be more effective just based on the opportunities I have. So if I have time I want to spend to help humanity, and I can do it within the Bitcoin space, and I can do it with any other space, I think the total impact will be bigger in Bitcoin. So that's one thing. And another issue is, so it's probably not a secret that I made some profit from buying Bitcoins earlier than now, and I think that helping Bitcoin succeed is part of my repayment to the world for what I profited.
So let's say altruistic motives.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll touch later on the Israeli Bitcoin Association and all the work you've been doing there. Now I want to ask actually maybe the opposite question, in a way. Like, can you steelman the arguments against Bitcoin? Can you take the critics' role for a second and try to tear Bitcoin apart and explain why isn't it going to work?
Yeah, okay, so there are several challenges that we could think of. I guess, the challenges belong to several categories. You have technological challenges and economic challenges and so on. So technologically, I think the main risk for Bitcoin going forward is the very same thing which Satoshi innovated, right? The reason that we didn't have Bitcoin before Bitcoin is that nobody knew how to solve the double spending problem in a decentralized way. And Satoshi came up with the concept of a blockchain and mining and using proof of work in this regard. So that was the solution. And that's why we were able to at all talk about Bitcoin or a decentralized cryptocurrency. But the question remains, is this solution really that good? And that's, the jury is still out. So it has to do with the funding of mining and the cost to the economy. So first, there is the issue of the cost of mining, which is significant. And then, you can argue about what is exactly the cost and whether it's worth it. And I think that the cost is indeed worth it for the benefit that it gives, but it does come at a cost. It's not a free solution, right? It's not some magical innovation that Satoshi found it and that's it, you have a currency that works for free. No, it has a significant cost, and there are risks, right? If we don't spend enough resources on mining, then any day an attacker could come and do a hash rate majority attack. So there are risks, and the only way to mitigate these risks is to spend a lot of resources on mining. So there is a question of whether this is good for the economy in total. So like I said, I do believe that it is, but there is a question, and it's not completely clear. Now, even if we agree that humanity as a whole is interested in paying this cost in order to enable Bitcoin, it's not clear how to actually raise the funds for it, right? There is so right now it's easy because there are new Bitcoins generated each block, so that's a reward that incentivizes miners. So that's what allows people to spend their resources.
Okay, but so you said, I'll summarize, you're saying that the economic model of mining is not yet battle-proven enough for the long run.
Yeah, but I do want to emphasize that, in a few decades from now, there will not be any significant new cost being generated. It will be based solely on transaction fees, and it's not clear what the market of transaction fees will look like.
Yep.
And there is, it depends on what restrictions there are at blocks and so on. So it's, nobody knows how exactly it will work. We hope that it will work, but we don't know.
Okay.
And it could be that the transaction fees will be too low to provide enough security from attacks, or if the transaction fees are too high, then it will be less usable. So, yeah.
What about the regulatory attack? Do you think that governments, what are the odds? Let's say if you had to give an odd in percentages between 0 and 100, what are the odds that governments will shut down Bitcoin in the majority of the world?
Well, in the very long term, I think it's close to 0, because so in the short to medium term, I don't see any indication that any developed government wants to shut down Bitcoin. If they wanted, they would have been more aggressive earlier. So it doesn't seem that they want to do it. I don't think that they will. But the thing is that even if theoretically the world governments unite and try to shut down Bitcoin, then the best they can do is put it down to the underground rights. So you will not have, shops advertising that they accept Bitcoin if it becomes illegal or something like that. But, in secret, in the underground, in cypherpunk communities, with political dissidents and so on, it will still be used, and it will be, something of a niche, something dormant, and it will wait until years or decades later where the political geoscape is more receptive for this. So governments can put it underground for a while, maybe even decades. They can't shut it down completely, or they can't shut down the vision completely if we look decades from now. So I think the whole thing with regulation, government, I think it's a very big challenge in the short and medium terms. In the long term, it's not really an issue. There is another issue that does exist in the long term, which is simply lack of interest, right? So, we think Bitcoin is great. It has all these advantages. But if people don't care about these advantages, or if they find, if they just are comfortable with the more traditional methods, then it will not have a lot of impact, right? It might be used with a few enthusiasts who appreciate it, but it will not have an actually big impact on the world and how the economy takes place. So that is, I think it is a somewhat significant risk, because there are a lot of great ideas that have popped up, and not in all of them people are interested.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a interesting vision for the future, and of course we will see how this develops. I want to ask just a couple of technical questions, maybe, or semi-technical questions. So you mentioned Lightning, right? So do you think, how is Lightning as a solution for scaling? Is it a good enough solution, or the ultimate solution, or is it still missing some key points?
Yeah, so I think something like Lightning is necessary. The basic concept on which Lightning is based is the ability to have transactions on the blockchain which represent several payments, right? So instead of every payment that I make, I need to broadcast to the whole Bitcoin network, I use a few transactions to establish a channel, and then whenever I need to make payment, I do it with a communication in a small scale with my counterparty for the channel and so on, without broadcasting it everywhere. I think something like this is necessary. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact same design of the Lightning Network as it is, but the concept, I think it's necessary. Without it, it's impossible to scale, at least not until there are real breakthroughs in all kinds of cryptography and information theory. I do think that if theoretically in the future there will be cryptographic primitives which allow a reliable sharding of the data, right? So, right now, every Bitcoin node needs to have full data of all transactions. If it doesn't know everything, then he has no business being a node. and yeah, without knowing everything, you can't verify that the transaction is real. Now, if we have a concept where each node only stores a piece of the data and it provides zero knowledge succinct proofs for what he knows about the data, so a node that wants to verify that the transaction is real, he needs to collect proofs from a few nodes, add to it the knowledge he has himself, and he can get, a verification that the transaction is real.
I actually haven't heard of zero knowledge as a solution to Bitcoin scaling. Is that your idea or people
well,
talking about
I'm not completely sure. Yeah, I haven't heard it being talked about a lot. I don't think I invented it. Well, the idea with zero knowledge, so zero knowledge is frequently touted as a privacy solution, which it can be, but the thing about the zero knowledge is not only that you can hide the knowledge, you also don't need to bother people with the knowledge, right? You can provide a succinct proof that something is happening without sending the whole thing. So I think this can potentially be a very powerful primitive for scalability. But the idea, as I said earlier, I think completely theoretical. The basic primitives are still not up to the task. And even if they were, the design of the system is a completely different design, which has more failure modes than Bitcoin as we know it today, right? So with Bitcoin, and if something is wrong, right, a transaction generates coins out of thin air or something like that, you can very, very easily see it, right? You see all the data, you can see this transaction, which shouldn't be real, and it provides, it generates 100 million Bitcoins, and there's a bug in the software and you can fix it. But when it's all based on zero knowledge proofs and really advanced cryptography and some things which are not even proven and so on, then there are much higher failure modes. So I don't know whether the hardcore Bitcoin users will accept such a setting, even if theoretically it's good. So yes, so that was rather long detours to say that there might be other solutions for scalability, but barring that, we do need something akin to Lightning Network, but it's not sufficient on its own, right? So I did a calculation once that even if everyone uses Lightning Network, so if we want Bitcoin to scale to the whole world, then the raw capacity of the chain needs to increase by a factor of maybe 200 from where it is now.
So that means like bigger blocks by a factor of 200, the rate of blocks?
So yeah, either that or that, right? In the language we use commonly, it's bigger blocks. So let's say 400 megabyte blocks or something like that. Of course, I do think there are also advantages to reducing the interval between blocks when used in conjunction with the ideas like those of Aviv Zohar, with the Spectre and so on. But in simple terminology, we talk about size of blocks, and it should be about 400 megabytes. And of course, it's a ballpark estimate, right? It could be higher or lower, but it will be needed at some point. And I do hope that by the time we get there, the hardware will be much better and so on, so it won't be prohibitive. Okay. So there will need to be more brute force increases in the block size and so on. There do need to be other scalability methods, but I think Lightning Network can go a long way, and it's pretty much necessary, but it does come with its own challenges, right? Many of the assumptions we make when we use on-chain Bitcoin are no longer true when we use Lightning, right? So there are many variations of this, but for example, in Bitcoin on-chain, you can accept payment when you're offline, right? If you give someone your Bitcoin address, then without asking you, he can send coins to that address. With Lightning Network, someone needs to be online to receive the payment. So that's a marked usability change. There's also the issue with the backups, right? So with on-chain Bitcoin, you have the seed from which all your private keys are generated deterministically. You store your seed once, and and you have backups for whatever you will have in the future. In Lightning Network, it doesn't work as well because you don't need just your keys, you need also the channel state. So the way backups will work will be different. Now, it's not a huge problem. There are solutions, and we can talk a lot about different solutions, but it is different. And, some people, some people think that Lightning Network means you just press a button and that's it. You can use Bitcoin like you wanted, but with infinite scalability, and that's not the case. So there are some costs, some changes, some risks, and so on. But yeah, I think it's worth it because this really allows you to send payments instantly and without any fees and in any scale you want.
It's not a secret that you've given a lot of funding to it and in your personal time. So I don't know what is the IBA's runway in terms of how many years it can last, like funding-wise, I guess. But I think maybe a more interesting question. You've been doing all of this pro bono, right? Just for altruistic purposes. But what has the, I don't know, has there been a negative impact of this work on you? What's the price that you pay for doing all this work?
Well, I'm not sure how much I want to go into that, but I will say that, it's probably not, okay, so the reason I spend all of my time working pro bono and also donate money, so that's because I can, right? If I couldn't do it, I wouldn't do it. I can spend all my time working pro bono, and a lot of people are not in that situation, and I think it changes my perspective a bit because a lot of people think in the mentality of how to put bread on the table, how to do work which will actually benefit them financially because they have to, and I'm not in the position where I need to worry about these things. So it's a bit, it changes the perspective in a bit ways, and in some ways I barely remember what it's like to actually need to work for a living. So I think it's so that's one cost where my perspective is changing, and not necessarily in a good way.
So a disconnect, let's say, for most of the people.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, and I will mention is that everyone who does work, I guess, does expect some kind of payment, but payment can be in many forms. It can be actual money, it can be satisfaction in the achievements, it can be the appreciation for people around you. So I, for a long time, have not worked for actual payment, but what I feed off is, the
recognition.
The recognition and the appreciation and the sense of achievement. And it's not always clear to me that people actually do appreciate my work. And like I said, with regards to achievement, we did accomplish some achievements, but not nearly as much as I would have wanted. So there is a bit of a tension there.
So do you, that's maybe my final question on this topic. So do you consider the IBA a success story? Is it easier now in 2019 to work with crypto than 2017? Or?
Well, I think the IBA has a lot of positive impact. Compared to the expectations we had back in 2013 when we started it, I think I wouldn't call it a success story. I think it didn't meet our expectations, both with the actual impact and achievements and with how the IBA itself works. So, I'm not sure what exactly was your vision back then, but I had some vision of how the IBA is supposed to work and how it's supposed to be perceived. And I'm not sure we got that to that point. Maybe we will in the future, I don't know. But so far it's not working exactly as intended. And again, with respect to impact, it did have impact, not as much as I would have wanted. So it's it's not a success story, it's not a failure story.
It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So and
Like, what do you think? Like, I know that personally, I ran into, me and a lot of other people have ran into the Israeli regulatory system and banking system, and I think that we have somewhat of a unique situation here compared to other Western countries. Like, it's very difficult here to work with banks and buy or sell crypto. Why do you think Israel is maybe the only Western country where it's so difficult to operate? Despite the efforts that we're doing, of course.
Yeah, well, okay, so first, it is true that it's more difficult in Israel than in a lot of other places. I don't know exactly to what extent, right? I haven't been personally out of Israel in the past 5 years, and I also haven't lived anywhere else and so on, so I don't know exactly how it's like in other countries. I believe they also have their own challenges, but it does seem that Israel is harder, and I don't know exactly, but I think it's a part of a kind of maybe paradox in Israel, where on the one hand, we have a lot of startups and innovation and entrepreneurship and so on, so it's a very advanced country in that respect. But I think with regulation in general, Israel is not so progressive, right? We see it in a lot of different aspects, not necessarily Bitcoin, but regulation here, I think, is a bit slow to adapt and very strict in some cases. So I think there is something, I don't know what exactly it is, but something that causes regulation in Israel in general to be a bit problematic and slower to adapt.
So my final question here is, who would you be interested in? Who should I interview next? Who would you be interested to watch an interview with? It can be in Israel or outside, but my focus currently is in Israel.
Yes, so that's a good question. I probably would not watch it myself, even if you did, whoever.
Satoshi.
Say, but that's of course would be interesting. But actually, I'm not even sure I remember all the people you have interviewed yet. Maybe was Udi with you already?
Yeah, I did an interview with Udi.
Yeah. So there is one possibility. Nadav Ivgi is another great possibility.
Yep.
Who else? I apologize in advance for all the people I'm not talking about. They're good people, but I think Nadav would be very interesting. Other than that,
I actually asked him, and so far he refused. But maybe in the future we'll agree. Okay. So thank you very much for joining me here, and thank you guys for watching this. Again, if you want to be notified of further interviews, then please just write me an email or subscribe to the channel, and we will see you again in the next interview. My next interview will be sometime next month, I think, with the Ofer Rotem. I will post an announcement later. Thank you.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.